I've always wondered if life is just a succession of doors we open without thinking, driven by impulses we barely understand. What if every choice is actually a silent invitation to cross boundaries we were never meant to touch? What if there are paths that, once stepped upon, never allow us to return? And what if love isn't what we believe it to be, but a shadow that follows us, demanding a price far too high for the feeling it gives? And what if death isn't an ending at all, but simply a change of voice, whispering into our ears the things we try so hard to forget? Yet its echo keeps vibrating inside me, a reminder that something was left unfinished, suspended, like still dust caught in a beam of light. Places where memory becomes so dense it almost has weight, density, temperature. What if I told you I walked into one of those places by accident, that I crossed a gate that wasn't meant for me, running from something I can no longer even name? What if I told you that from that moment on, I've lived in a strange threshold between what I remember and what I fear discovering? Maybe everything began with a simple question: what do you do when you have nowhere left to go? What do you do when your heart is so tired that every light feels like a threat, and every shadow feels like shelter? I just wanted to disappear for one night. Just one night. I wasn't asking for anything more than that, and I ended up entering the wrong mansion, but maybe the mistake was just the gentlest way of leading me exactly where I was meant to be from the beginning. Because some encounters don't happen by chance. Some presences recognize us before we can recognize them, and there are places, especially places that seem to choose us. As I walked through the abandoned garden of that colossal house, I felt something watching me, not with hostility, but with a strange familiarity, as if I were expected. Not the bright and simple kind of love found in the living world, but something denser, sadder, almost cold. The kind of love formed between two souls that recognize each other through pain, not joy. Because there were signs, small, almost invisible, but present. The wind carried whispers. The dark windows watched me patiently. The air seemed to slow around me, as if the atmosphere itself asked for silence to hear my steps more clearly. And what I found inside, well, that still lingers in my bones. It began with the way I always felt something missing inside me, like a forgotten part calling from far away. The door is opening. The smell of old wood and wet leaves was the first thing that wrapped around me, followed by a deep, rhythmic silence, like the sleeping breath of something immense. It was night, but inside, even the night felt different, heavier, denser. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the beginning of the end of my solitude, and the beginning of everything that would transform me. And so, with my heart racing and my soul unsteady, I took my first step into the mansion. The exact moment the door closed behind me, I felt something change, something permanent, and that was when I realized I was no longer alone. Elias began to realize that the diary seemed recent, perhaps months old, maybe just a few years. It wasn't a relic from centuries past, as he had expected, and that unsettled him even more. On one of the pages he found the first clear mention of the young woman from the portraits. She was writing about herself. Sometimes I see myself reflected in mirrors I don't remember passing by. Other times, I think it's me who watches, trapped inside these portraits that seem more alive than I am. The realization made a shiver crawl from the base of Elias's neck all the way down his spine. The scent on the handkerchief, the floral smell lingering in the air, the portraits whose eyes seemed to follow him. Someone had been there, or had been there recently. But where were they now? He turned the page again, emotionally cautious. Today I heard someone in the garden. Light steps. hesitant. I didn't go see who it was. Maybe I shouldn't. Sometimes I feel as though what arrives here doesn't come by choice. It comes by necessity. Elias closed the diary for a moment, trying to organize the silent storm within himself. The rain outside continued to fall, now with less force, as if it had lost part of its initial fury. The softer sound gave the mansion an almost meditative tone, as though the world had stepped back a little more, leaving space for him to breathe and for the house's story to wrap around him completely. The armchair near the window with the neatly folded blanket and the floral-scented handkerchief looked as though it awaited someone who had just risen from it. Perhaps the diary's author. Perhaps the woman in the portraits. Perhaps both one and the same silent presence marked by the melancholy that clung to everything there. Elias felt a need to look back into the hall, at the portraits, at every detail surrounding him. Something in the atmosphere was beginning to shift, as if the house, realizing his interest in the diary, began to watch him more closely, or more patiently. He stood, still holding the notebook between his fingers, and walked toward the corridor. The lamp's light stayed behind, casting a long shadow that moved with him, almost like a second presence. The sounds were minimal, only the ancient wood creaking beneath his steps and the soft echo that the room amplified. The corridor was darker than before, though he was certain the light earlier hadn't been so dim. Something felt heavier, more compact, as if the air itself was paying attention. Near the door leading back to the main hall, Elias noticed a new detail, something he had not seen before. A flower petal. Small, delicate, a soft shade of pink. It lay on the floor right at his feet, as if placed there recently. He bent down to pick it up. The fragrance rising from it was the same floral scent from the handkerchief. And then another petal, a little farther ahead, and another, closer to the staircase. A subtle trail, delicate, almost intentional, as though someone had passed through. As though he had been guided. Or as though someone wished to guide him. Elias followed the petals to the base of the main staircase. They climbed the first flight of steps, forming a nearly poetic path, as if leading him to something he needed to see or to something that had been waiting for him for a long time. The diary felt heavier in his hands now, not in real weight, but in meaning. As he placed his foot on the first step, he sensed a change in the air as if someone inhaled deeply upstairs, waiting for his next movement. He didn't know what he would find at the top of that staircase, but he wasn't sure he could turn back either, because something inside him surged with an intense and inexplicable need, the feeling that he was about to rediscover something he didn't know he had lost, or someone, and in that instant caught between the first and second steps Elias was certain of one thing: the mansion was alive around him, and it would not let him leave until he uncovered the truth that filled it, and the truth that filled him. The shadow Elias thought he had seen at the top of the staircase vanished as quickly as it had appeared, as if it had dissolved into the thin air of the upper floor. Even so, that brief impression was enough to ignite a disturbing combination of fear, fascination, and an odd sense of recognition in his body. He remained still for a few seconds, one hand resting on the cold banister, as if he needed one last moment before deciding whether to go on. The mansion seemed to hold him in suspension, as though the ceiling itself breathed faintly, waiting for his next move. The rain outside had diminished to a distant murmur, allowing the inner silence of the house to become more noticeable. But this silence wasn't empty. It carried its own memory, almost tangible, as if something there remembered him before he ever arrived. Drawing a deep breath, Elias climbed another step, and another. The ancient wood groaned beneath his feet, but not randomly. There was a rhythm to it, as if each of his steps matched a note of a melody he couldn't fully hear but sensed in the structure of the house itself. He ascended slowly, observing the walls covered with old wallpaper, patterned with flowers whose colors had long faded. In some sections, moisture had warped the design, creating shapes that resembled faces, silhouettes, shadows. At the top of the staircase, a wide corridor stretched in both directions. The light was weaker there, filtered through half-open doors and the faint glow from a window at the far end. A soft scent of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the floral perfume that had been following Elias since the ground floor. He hesitated, then turned right, where the petals continued their silent guidance. The small pink marks formed a delicate trail leading to a partially open door. It was clear someone had passed through recently, someone quiet but not entirely invisible. Elias approached the door slowly. Inside there was a spacious bedroom whose decor revealed meticulous care, as though it had been prepared for someone who might return at any moment. A dark wooden bed, covered with pristine light-colored sheets, was perfectly arranged. An antique dresser held small perfume bottles, fine combs, and an oval mirror with an ornate frame. But what drew Elias's attention the most was the detail on the windowsill, a bouquet of dried flowers tied with a blue ribbon. Beside it lay a single fresh petal, the same shade as the ones he had followed. The window was slightly open, allowing a gentle breeze to sway the lace curtain. The pale outdoor light bathed the room in a tone that felt more like memory than real illumination. Elias stepped inside with timid movements, afraid to disturb something or someone. The floral perfume was stronger here, as if this was the heart of its origin, the signature of a constant, quiet, powerful presence. That strange familiarity washed over him again, stronger this time. It felt like he was revisiting a place he'd known in long-lost dreams, repeated throughout his life, but forgotten upon waking. He approached the dresser and noticed that one of the perfume bottles was open, with small droplets spilled near the cap. There was no way to know if it had happened minutes, hours, or days earlier, but the scent was far too fresh for a room abandoned. On the bed, one of the pillows had a faint indentation, as if someone had been sitting there moments before he arrived. Elias swallowed hard. The idea that another person was in the house sharpened his senses. He didn't know if he should call out or remain in total silence. Then he heard the sound. A soft, almost imperceptible tap, echoing from the opposite wall. It wasn't the natural creak of old wood. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, intentional, like fingers gently tapping a surface. One tap, pause, another pause, a third. Elias froze. His breathing shortened, as if the air had suddenly thickened. The mansion seemed to wait for his reaction, observing each fiber of his body tighten. He turned slowly toward the sound. The wall where it came from was covered by an old tapestry depicting a pastoral scene, a sunlit field, white flowers, and a female figure walking among them. The tapestry's colors were faded, but its presence dominated the room in an almost hypnotic way. Then Elias noticed something beneath it. A gap. The tapestry wasn't entirely flush against the wall. A small space allowed the window's breeze to move the fabric slightly. Behind it, there was something, a recess, perhaps an opening or a hidden door. His heartbeat quickened. Of all the strange sensations he had experienced since entering that mansion, this one felt the most dangerous. Old houses often had secret passages, but the idea of one inside that specific bedroom, a place filled with perfume, presence, and memory struck him with deep unease. He approached the tapestry and, very carefully, pulled it aside. Behind it, confirming his suspicions, was a narrow old door with rusted hinges, but that wasn't what disturbed him most. It was the fact that the door was slightly open, and behind it was absolute darkness. A cold breath of air escaped through the gap, touching Elias's face like someone exhaling close to him. He swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. The sensation in his body was paradoxical, fear and attraction, danger and promise, as if the darkness held something he needed to see but perhaps could not bear. Then, from within the darkness, something happened, a fragrance. The same floral perfume, strong, present, as if someone were there, breathing in the dark. And at that moment a thought invaded his mind, not like his own idea, but like something whispered by a voice he didn't hear but felt. Enter. The house demanded it. Fate demanded it. And the story waiting behind that passage was about to change everything. Elias knew that if he opened that door, there would be no easy return, perhaps no return at all. For a moment, Elias kept his hands suspended over the narrow door's wooden surface, as if something invisible held his wrist. The cold air escaping from the gap was almost tangible, mingling with the floral perfume so intensely it seemed to create its own atmosphere right there. On the threshold between the bedroom and that hidden space, at that exact moment, the mansion wasn't just a setting, it was a presence, as silent, observing, almost expectant presence. When his fingers finally touched the door, the rough texture of the wood and the dust gathered there told stories of time and abandonment. Yet between the layers of dust, delicate fingerprints suggested recent use, as though someone had left a trail for this very moment. Elias felt goosebumps. Nothing here seemed entirely accidental. He pushed the door gently, and the creak echoed long through the house, as if it traveled through decades of silence at once. Slowly, the opening widened, revealing a narrow corridor, swallowed in dimness. There was an old lantern fixed to the wall, its glass fogged and marked by age, but no flame burned inside it. Still, a faint light came from somewhere deeper within, a pale glow, just enough to hint at shapes. Stepping inside that corridor was like crossing a threshold between two worlds. Behind him, the bedroom held the appearance of an inhabited space, with the perfumed handkerchief, glass bottles, a neatly arranged bed. Ahead of him, the corridor seemed to condense time into a single, continuous thread, a succession of invisible moments layered atop one another, waiting to be noticed. The floor was made of dark wood, narrow planks creaking under his steps with a more muffled sound than the rest of the house. The walls, covered in simple plaster, bore small cracks and moisture stains, as if the heart of the mansion had sickened over the years. In some spots, rusty hooks suggested old lanterns or pictures that were no longer there. Everything hinted at intimate, repeated use, as if this path was known by few, and needed by fewer still. As he moved forward, Elias sensed the feeling of being watched grow stronger. There were no noises, no footsteps, besides his. But the corridor seemed to subtly narrow, forcing him to stay upright, gaze fixed forward, breathing controlled. The floral scent accompanied every movement, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, as if adjusting itself to the thoughts overtaking him. He wondered who had walked this path before. The woman in the portraits, surely. The diary's author, likely the same person. Perhaps she had sought refuge, silence, or a secret vantage point from which to observe the rest of the house. After several more steps, the corridor opened into a small antechamber, square-shaped with a slightly lower ceiling. There was a single wooden chair set against the wall and, above it, a small niche with an empty ceramic vase. The simplicity contrasted with the rest of the mansion, as if this space was meant for something specific, almost ritualistic. To the left stood a solid wooden door. To the right, an open passage, leading down a narrow staircase toward a deeper, less accessible part of the house. In the corner of the antechamber, more pink petals rested on the floor. Something in his instinct combined with the curiosity that had accompanied him since the entrance all pointed toward books, records, memories. Maybe there would be more notebooks, letters, documents tied to the feminine presence emanating from the entire house. When he pushed the door, he found a compact room dense with meaning. It was a private study, apparently hidden from the rest of the house, with shelves filled with carefully arranged books and notebooks. A central desk stood there, with a high-backed chair, and on its surface lay a neatly stacked pile of papers, an old inkwell, and a quill dried by time. The room carried a notable scent of aged paper, dry ink and, once again, the floral perfume that threaded through every space. Elias felt as though he had entered the very core of the house's memories. It was as if each object had witnessed silent confessions, decisions made under lamplight, tears shed without witnesses. He approached the desk and noticed there was a second notebook, similar to the one he had found in the room with the fireplace. This time, the cover was light, with a slightly golden border already worn at the edges. In many entries, the mansion was mentioned almost as a person, as a silent interlocutor. She described the habit of hearing footsteps in the corridors when the house was supposedly empty, spoke of the wind that stopped by the windows as if weighing whether or not to come inside. She also wrote of a strange sense that, at some point in the future, someone would cross the gate and change everything. As if my words were seeds cast into a distant field, waiting for footsteps that have yet to touch this ground. I don't know who he is, nor when he will come, but the certainty of his future presence stays with me more faithfully than the people I can see. As he read that, a chill ran through Elias from head to toe. It wasn't just the coincidence of his being there, reading those words after entering that mansion on pure impulse. It was the feeling of fit, of alignment, of something that had long been awaited finally happening, of his being part of that event. The author went on another page. Sometimes I think this person will not come in life, that maybe he is only an image, a reflection, an echo. Other times, I am certain his steps will touch the floor of this house, that his hands will touch these pages, and that when that happens, something will finally fall into place, like a door that opens after a long time locked from the inside. It was impossible for Elias to ignore the sensation that those lines recognized him. It was as if the house, through that woman, had extended a thread toward him long before he could ever imagine being there. The emotion forming in his chest was not only fear or astonishment, there was also a deep melancholy and a strange tenderness, as if he had been expected. He turned a few more pages and found mentions of a love cut short, of an absence that had never been filled. There weren't enough details to fully decipher what had happened, but the tone was one of persistent mourning, of a bond that refused to be erased. Pressed between some sections of the text were small dried petals, as though every painful memory needed a delicate symbol to be endured. Elias closed the journal for a moment, feeling the weight of other people's stories mixing with the weight of his own. His flight that night had also been born from a love that seemed to have collapsed, from promises he had failed to keep, from an emotional exhaustion that had driven him to distance himself from everything. Now, there in that room, he realized how his pain found its mirror in that house. Maybe the mansion was, at its core, a place where similar sorrows recognized one another. He lifted his gaze to the shelves and noticed that, beyond books and notebooks, there were small boxes, carefully arranged, as if each one held something precious. Photographs, perhaps letters, fragments of lives that had needed to be archived so that the house could remain standing. Elias had the clear sensation that the deeper he ventured into those memories, the more the mansion would take root inside him. There was an implicit exchange. He gained answers, but surrendered parts of himself. When he turned to leave the room, ready to perhaps explore the staircase that descended through the open passage, he noticed something that had escaped his attention before. On the surface of the desk, beside the inkwell, there was a clean rectangular spacer, pale, empty rectangle, in contrast with the dust around it, as if an object had been there until very recently. A book, perhaps, a third notebook, a missing piece. The conclusion came to him immediately, almost obviously. The notebook he first found in the room with the fireplace and the armchair facing the window probably belonged to that set. Someone had moved it from this room to another, at some recent moment. That meant that, until not long ago, someone had still been walking between those spaces, shifting pieces, rearranging memories. He wasn't just walking through someone's remnants. He was walking in that person's footsteps. And in some mysterious way, each step brought him closer not only to the house's story, but also to a love story that had not yet fully begun, though it had been in the making for a very long time. The presence of the damp petal right at the center of the small pile made Elias's heart beat faster, not in a panic, but in a deep, resonant rhythm, as if answering a silent call. That fresh petal was a message. There was no other plausible explanation. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't wind, it wasn't chance. Someone or something had been following each of his steps, guiding his path through the house with both delicacy and intention. That was not just a scent. Standing again, he turned toward the opening on the right side of the antechamber, the narrow staircase that led down into the mansion's deeper interior. Unlike the private study he had just explored, the stairway seemed wrapped in a denser gloom, as if it descended toward a part of the house where time was heavier, older, more jealously guarded. The first step on the stairs produced a hollow, almost funereal sound. Elias gripped the handrail, feeling the wood cold and slightly damp. It felt like touching the mansion's spine, as if the staircase formed a link between buried layers of memory. The air below had a different texture, thicker, as though decades of silence and secrets rested there. The floral perfume was still present, but now mixed with the smell of old stone, a scent similar to that of crypts, forgotten cellars, or rooms no one entered anymore, except to remember they still existed. As he descended, Elias had the impression that the sound of his breathing was amplified around him. The mansion seemed to listen. The staircase ended in a narrow corridor lit only by the weak glow of a single high window set near the top of the stone wall. The light that entered was gray, filtered by night and rain, forming beams that hid more than they revealed. The corridor had doors on both sides, but all of them were closed, all but one, at the far end. That slightly ajar door emanated the same soft glow he had seen in the unlit lantern upstairs, as if some invisible light spilled from within. It was impossible to resist the urge to walk toward it. Each step echoed louder than the last, as if the floor grew more sensitive as he advanced. To his left, one door bore deep marks in the wood, like scratches from sharp objects long ago. Elias ignored both sides, focused only on the door left open. The closer he came, the more the floral perfume enveloped him, now accompanied by a gentle note of old paper and something sweet, something that reminded him of ripe fruit, a strange combination for an underground space, but at the same time deeply familiar. When he pushed the door, he found an unexpected room. It wasn't a cellar, It wasn't a storage room. It wasn't a basement. It was a wide, almost circular chamber, with light stone walls and well-kept wooden floors. It looked like a secret room preserved with care, hidden from daylight and from time's destructive touch. In the center stood a large, old table, covered with objects that seemed to have been left there not by neglect, but because they were still in use by someone who continued to return to that place. On the table lay a bundle of letters tied with a dark ribbon. A carved wooden box adorned with floral symbols. A book without a title, dust settled only along its edges. And, more disturbingly, a portrait. Elias approached the portrait with slow steps. The painting, resting on an easel, showed the young woman from the hall's portraits, but this time not in a formal pose, not in a distant setting, not as a ghost of the past captured on canvas. She was different here. Seated, wearing a simple light dress, no jewelry, her hair loose, and she was looking directly at the artist, at the point of view of the painting and, by extension, at him. But it wasn't just that. Her expression, in this portrait, was serene, and there was a sadness so profound in her eyes that it seemed to spill beyond the paint, reaching whoever stood before the frame. Her gaze carried a feeling Elias recognized without ever having lived beside this woman. Longing. A deep, unexplained longing. A slight tremor passed through his hands. Something in that expression felt meant for him, not in a literal sense, but an emotional one. As if this woman had loved someone who never returned. As if the portrait were the memory of a farewell that never received an answer. Behind the table, a dark leather armchair faced the painting, as if it were the chosen spot of someone who often came there just to look at that face, who sat there, who felt that absence so intensely. Then Elias saw something even stranger. On the arm of the chair there was a handkerchief. Not just any handkerchief. It was identical to the one from the room upstairs. And just as recent, he picked it up. The scent was strong, as if someone had left it there only moments ago. The mansion seemed to pulse. He turned back to the objects on the table. The bundle of letters drew his attention. He touched them and felt that the ribbon around them was loose, almost inviting. The envelope's paper was thick, of an older make, but the ribbon held no dust. It had been handled, used, moved. Elias picked up the first letter, but before he could open it, something changed in the room. A sound, very faint, but real. A breath. It wasn't his. It came from the right-hand corner of the room, from the spot where the shadow was thickest. That line between the visible and the secret. Elias went still. The breathing continued soft, feminine, deep, as if someone was standing there watching his every movement. He didn't dare turn his head right away. The breath grew closer, clearer, warmer, and then, the floral perfume filled the air all at once, so strong that Elias had the distinct sensation that someone was just inches from the back of his neck, observing him. Instinctively, he turned. Nothing, only shadow. But on the floor, there was now something that hadn't been there before. A petal, damp, newly placed, just like the other one. Left where he would surely see it. Left by someone who clearly wanted him to know. She was there, and had always been. Elias shivered intensely, not with pure fear but with a deep, visceral, inexplicable recognition, as if he were encountering a presence known only by the heart. He looked back at the portrait, and was certain the eyes seemed more alive, as if they glowed faintly under the pale light from the underground window, as if they reacted to his presence. He stepped back. The wood creaked beneath his heels. The feminine breath stopped, completely, and in the heavy silence that followed, Elias noticed something he hadn't realized before. The door he had entered through was now completely closed. The handle was as cold as iron left out in the night rain. Elias wrapped his fingers around it, feeling the cold spread through his hand and slowly climb his wrist, as if the door itself were breathing against him. The step he had heard on the other side had not been his imagination. He knew that with absolute certainty. It had been a real sound, solid, full of intent. There had been no haste in it, no uncertainty. It was the step of someone who simply was there. Elias tried to turn the handle. It did not move, not even a millimeter. It was as if a silent yet undeniable force held the door from the other side. Not locked, just restrained. Kept in place by someone who did not want him to leave. His breathing quickened, but wasn't entirely dominated by fear. There was a strange familiarity to the sensation, as though, in some inexplicable way, he was exactly where he was supposed to be in that moment. He pressed his ear to the door. Nothing, no breath, no footsteps. no rustle of fabric, but there was something, a silence so dense it almost had presence, as if it hid more than it revealed, as if someone were on the other side, motionless, waiting, not withdrawing, not advancing, just waiting. Elias stepped back, still holding the perfumed handkerchief he'd found on the armchair. The floral scent filled the room, but now it seemed to concentrate closer to him, as if it had been brought by the air itself, or by whoever was behind the door. Every petal found so far gained a new meaning. They weren't empty symbols, but gestures of presence, invitations, callings. He turned toward the underground room again, trying to regain control of his own thoughts. He needed to understand the place where he was trapped physically and emotionally. The table with the letters now seemed to hold secrets that pulsed. The book with no title remained silent, like a heart waiting to be touched. The armchair, empty, seemed to still retain someone's warmth. The portrait of the woman, however, was the most unsettling presence. The painted eyes seemed to watch him with a deeper, almost sweet sadness, while a new glimmer appeared in them, a brightness that hadn't been there before, or that perhaps he'd lacked the courage to notice. It was as if the woman in the portrait not only recognized his entering the room, but had been waiting for him. Elias approached the painting again. With each step, the feeling grew stronger. That image seemed alive, not in the literal supernatural sense, but in a deep emotional vibration. There was warmth in her expression, there was absence, there was longing, there was pain. He lifted his hand and touched the frame. The wood was warm. At that instant, something changed in the room. The extinguished lamp on the left wall emitted a brief spark, a short flicker, as if trying to light itself. A second spark followed, then a third. None formed a flame, but the attempt was clear enough to make Elias' stomach turn cold. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a mechanical fault. It was a reaction. As if the presence there responded to his touch, as if that place were an extension of her. And then, for the first time since he arrived in the chamber, he noticed the most subtle and unexpected sound of all. Something like fabric moving. A soft brushing, like the hem of a dress gliding across the floor. The sound came from inside the room, not from the hallway, behind him. Elias turned immediately. Nothing. Only shadow, only perfume, only the absolute certainty that he wasn't alone. His heart pounded, but his body, paradoxically, did not urge him to flee. It urged understanding. It urged closeness. It was as if a dormant part of him recognized that presence, even without a name, face, or concrete form. The eyes in the portrait seemed to call him back, but the letters on the table also drew him in, as if they contained answers that could no longer wait. He moved toward the table and untied the ribbon holding the stack of envelopes. The first envelope, thick, cream-colored paper, bore handwriting he already recognized, the same as in the diary. On the outside, there was only one word. For him. Elias felt his stomach twist. For him. But for whom? His hands trembled as he opened the letter. The smell of old ink escaped along with the floral scent, a harmony so perfect it felt intentional. The letter read, "If one day you enter this house, you will know it wasn't by accident. You did not come by choice. You came because I called you, not by the name I never knew, but by the space you would occupy in me. I know the world will bring you here when everything inside you is fragmented. I know you will arrive when you have nowhere else to look. And I know my perfume will guide you, even if you do not know how you recognize it." Elias felt the air vanish from his lungs. He kept reading, unable to stop. "I know I will be gone when you arrive, but I will not be absent. I remain in everything, in the house, in the silence, and in every petal I leave for you. Do not fear the door that closes. It closes to protect you from what you are not ready to know. When you hear my footsteps, do not run." The letter ended with a long stroke. No signature, no date. Only an emotional echo so powerful that Elias couldn't control the faint tremor in his hands. The step on the other side of the door echoed in his memory like a confirmation, a fulfillment of the letter, not a threat. The silence that followed was complete, heavy, almost ritualistic. And then, something changed. The doorknob behind him, the one that kept him from leaving, trembled. A small movement, a test, as if someone touched it from the other side, checking whether he was still there. Elias turned slowly, the letter in hand. The floral perfume intensified, almost like an invisible embrace wrapping around him. The doorknob trembled again, this time a little stronger, delicate, but firm, not meant to frighten him, meant to call him. and when the vibration stopped, another sound followed. His name, not spoken aloud, but remembered inside him, as if a voice he had never heard whispered into his soul. Elias. He closed his eyes, a warm wave rushing through his chest. Impossible, yet real. When he opened his eyes, the room felt more alive. The grey light from the underground window had brightened, illuminating the portrait more clearly. The woman's eyes seemed to shine, and the door, once firmly shut, was now slightly open. The presence on the other side had allowed it. Elias stepped forward. The hallway seemed to await him, the air lighter, more receptive, as if approving his reading of the letter. He knew he was being guided, and every step he took was part of something greater, something that hadn't begun there, but had found him there. With the letter still in hand, Elias pushed the door. It opened without resistance. And in the hallway, there was only one thing on the floor. A petal, damp, and beside it, a faint print of a woman's foot. The silhouette by the window was as clear as it was fleeting, a feminine outline, delicate hair flowing over her shoulders, the dress moving with her as if it were part of her. There was no visible face, only the certainty that those eyes, though undefined, were fixed directly on Elias. In a nearly involuntary blink, she was gone. The hallway became just a hallway again, but the sense that something had been confirmed was unmistakable. The mansion didn't hold only memories. It held presences. And Elias was not the first to walk those invisible steps, but somehow, he was the expected one. He stood still for a few moments, trying to balance what he felt. It wasn't his first time facing something he couldn't understand, but it was the first time that incomprehension felt essential, as if his own inner story, full of poorly digested losses, broken promises, and an interrupted love, echoed in that underground place, finding there a silent mirror. The letter in his hand still weighed on him. Not because of the paper, but because of the words. Someone had called him, someone had written to him before even knowing his name, predicting his arrival in that house, in that room, at that exact moment in life when he no longer had solid ground beneath him. His arrival at the mansion, which had seemed accidental, now took on the shape of fate. He walked down the hallway, approaching the narrow window at its end, the same one where he'd seen the silhouette. The light coming through was weak, filtered by stained glass and the rainy night outside, but enough to reveal the dust on the ledge, the old scratches on the glass, and nearly invisible finger marks, as if someone often rested their hands there while watching the world outside. That imagined scene, a silent woman looking through that same window, again and again filled Elias' mind almost painfully. He pictured her there, every night, waiting for something that never came. Someone who never arrived, an ending that never happened. It was strange how that scene echoed his own shapeless sense of waiting. Elias' past wasn't made of grand public tragedies, but of small, intimate disasters, losses without ceremony, promises dissolved into silence, especially one, the abrupt end of a love in which he never knew whether he'd been the victim or the accomplice of its ruin. What had brought him to that small town, on that rainy night, was a kind of existential tiredness, fed by a guilt he couldn't properly define. The mansion, with its portraits and diaries, with its perfumes and petals, seemed to understand all of this without him needing to explain. When he lifted his gaze, he saw his own reflection in the glass, the tired face, the shadows under his eyes, the expression of someone who had forgotten what belonging felt like, and for a second his reflection seemed to blend with another outline more delicate just behind him, a faint, almost translucent figure, as if someone were standing at his back looking at the same world through the same window. In an instinctive reflex, Elias turned. Nothing, only the empty hallway. Only the persistent sweet perfume, which seemed to linger a few seconds longer than it should, as though the presence hesitated before leaving completely. He knew that if he stayed there any longer, he would begin to lose the line between what belonged to him and what belonged to the mansion. So he decided to go upstairs. The narrow staircase returned his steps with a different echo from the one during his descent. Before, there had been weight, fear, a silent sense of intrusion. Now, there was almost an unspoken agreement. The house accepted him, and that acceptance was as unsettling as any threat. When he reached the antechamber, he saw that the pile of petals remained exactly as he had left it. Nothing had moved. A small detail, but important. What changed, what appeared and disappeared, did not do so chaotically. There was a logic, an intention, as if the interventions were controlled, calculated, almost careful. From the study filled with books and notebooks came the scent of old paper and ink. Part of Elias wanted to go back and keep reading, to dive deeper into the words of the woman who seemed to have foreseen him before he even understood himself. But another part, quieter yet firm, whispered that it was too soon. He needed to breathe different air first, feel the rest of the house. Remember the outside world, if the outside world still made any sense. Climbing the staircase hidden behind the tapestry, he felt as if he were emerging from another time, as though he had crossed a tunnel not only physical but chronological. When he returned to the young woman's bedroom, the room of the perfume, of the half-open window, of the carefully made bed, he felt that the place now held more layers than before. The objects there weren't just objects, they were witnesses. The armchair by the window, the dresser with bottles and a mirror, the bouquet of dried flowers on the ledge, everything seemed to carry the mark of a presence that had filled that space intensely. Elias approached the bed and ran his hand lightly over the sheet's fabric. No dust, no stiffness typical of something unused for a long time. That room wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. The idea that she might still move through the house, even in another form, grew stronger within him, not just a supernatural hypothesis. Almost a necessity for meaning, an interrupted love, unfulfilled promises, letters written for someone who might never arrive. All of it begged for continuation. He somehow became that continuation. Leaving the room, Elias returned to the upper hallway, the walls lined with old wallpaper, the high ceiling, the portraits along the path, everything seemed to observe him more clearly now. As he passed one of the paintings, he noticed a detail he hadn't seen before. It was another painting of the same woman, but this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her, a man with gentle features, a melancholic gaze, and a slightly hunched posture, as if the weight of the world had reached him before the years. The face was not exactly similar to Elias's, but there was something in the expression, especially in the eyes, that made him shudder. The way that man looked at her, in the painting, carried a mixture of tenderness and guilt. It was a gaze that said, there was love, but also, there was failure. Elias unwillingly saw there a distorted reflection of his own story. He too had loved, he too had failed, he too had left someone behind at some point, or been left, it hardly mattered. The pain felt similar. The woman, in the painting, did not look directly at the man. She gazed at some distant point, as if unable to fully face him, out of fear, shame, or overwhelming longing. It was a painting of a love that had never reached its conclusion. Elias looked away, feeling an old weight awaken in his chest. The mansion seemed made of precisely that, unfinished loves, suspended promises, memories that refused to disappear. He went down the main staircase back to the ground floor with slower steps. When he reached the hall, he had a sudden impulse. He approached the large front door, the one he had passed through while fleeing the rain. He wanted, somehow, to test external reality. He needed to know if there was still a world outside that could be reached. His hand touched the doorknob, cold, solid, familiar. He turned it. The doorknob yielded, but the door did not. A muffled crack echoed. Something seemed to jam inside the wooden and iron structure. It wasn't a lock, it wasn't a chain, it wasn't a key. It was as if a greater weight were braced against the door from the outside, or as if the house had simply decided it wouldn't open. Elias tried a second time, using more strength. Nothing. His breathing quickened for a few seconds, not from pure desperation, but from the confirmation of what he already suspected deep down. Freedom was now a more abstract idea than a concrete one. He could walk through the corridors, go up, go down, open doors, read letters. But the exit? And, above all, it felt tragically lonely. The escape that had brought him there was starting to lose its shape. What took form now was a bond. From that position, he could see the window, the blurred reflections outside, and part of the room, including the table with the diary. The house is not a prison. I will wait. While Elias remained in the armchair, the closed diary resting on his lap and his eyes lost in the dimness, the lamp's flame flickered for a brief second, casting moving shadows along the walls, and, reflected almost imperceptibly in the glass of the window, another image appeared overlaid on his, the soft outline of a woman's face, slowly drawing closer, as if she wanted to whisper something in his ear. The mansion, at last, made it clear, he was not there by accident, and now, he could no longer leave. The reflection in the glass was too subtle to be a complete image, yet intense enough to change the air around Elias. The feminine presence appeared like a luminous blur, almost a mist with its own outline, emanating a gentle energy that was nothing like a threat, but wasn't comforting either. It was the kind of presence that makes the heart race not from fear, but from recognition. When he blinked, the image vanished from the window, but the floral perfume remained, a perfume that seemed to be growing closer and closer to him, almost as close as a breath. Elias drew in a deep breath, closed the diary on his lap, and let his head fall back against the chair. He was exhausted, but not physically. The fatigue came from within, as if each new revelation of the house opened a door inside himself, revealing memories or feelings he thought he had buried. And yet, what disturbed him most was the growing feeling that he was not just learning that woman's story, but remembering something that shouldn't he belong to him. The lamp's flame flickered again, stronger this time, casting shadows that moved as if they had lives of their own. The faint warmth of the bulb brushed Elias's face, and he felt something different in the air, a light vibration, almost like a shiver that didn't start in the body, but in the soul. He lifted his eyes, and he saw, without any doubt, right beside the door to the room where the shadow was thickest, there was the suggestion of a human form, not completely defined, like a dark figure surrounded by a faint light, but clear enough for him to understand. Someone was watching him. Elias's heart gave an involuntary jolt, but, contrary to what he expected, there was no panic. There was only an inexplicable warmth in his chest, a call he didn't understand but didn't want to ignore. The shadow moved a little closer, with almost inaudible steps, as if it didn't quite touch the floor. The floral perfume flooded the room, filling every corner, becoming almost tangible. Elias rose slowly from the armchair. His body didn't freeze, quite the opposite. It was as if something guided him to stand, as if the mere proximity of that presence awakened in him the need to move toward it. He took a step. The shadow retreated slightly, and, for a moment, Elias felt as though he had entered a delicate game of advance and retreat, like two strangers recognizing each other through gestures. But before he could move any closer, the figure dissolved. It didn't vanish abruptly, it simply became perfume, and light, and nothing. The room fell silent again, and in the place where the presence had stood, something had been left behind. A petal, fresh again, damp again, vivid again. Ilias approached, knelt, and picked up the petal carefully. Its softness, the moist sheen, the fragility, everything about it felt freshly plucked, as if it had just fallen from the dress of someone who had passed there seconds before. When he rose, his eyes landed on the open door that led to the mansion's central corridor, and, for the first time, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The corridor was lit, not by the lamp, not by an electric light, not by any logical source. A soft, golden, almost twilight glow ran along the corridor, as if coming from windows that did not exist. The house seemed to have found its own way to light his path, or, perhaps, it was showing Elias exactly where it wanted him to go. He felt the pull, an almost instinctive attraction to follow that glow. It was different from the cold light that had illuminated the underground level. This one was warm, gentle, almost embracing. It carried a different feeling, not just remembrance, but promise. Elias walked down the corridor with slow steps, while the light guided him like a visible breeze. The walls seemed to breathe at his sides. The paintings, with their serious faces, seemed to follow him with their eyes, some with sorrow, others with expectation. The feeling of being led, rather than simply walking, was too intense to ignore. At the end of the corridor, the light led him to a pair of double doors made of dark wood, with elaborate carvings depicting branches, flowers, and a crescent moon at the center of each panel. It was the first door Elias had seen that seemed to hold some kind of symbolic meaning. The carved flowers, similar to the petals he kept finding along the way, suggested that this door was just beautiful. It was important. Ilias's fingers rested on the wood as if touching the surface of a person, not an object. The warmth he felt there was not natural. He pushed the doors slowly. When they opened, they revealed a large, circular hall, lit by dozens of candles scattered over old holders. The smell of burning wax mixed with the floral perfume. The air was heavy with emotion, as if this hall had been the stage for something intense, a meeting, a loss, a farewell. The walls were covered with deep wine-colored curtains that fell heavily to the dark wooden floor. In the center of the room, there was a round table, and upon it, a book, small, white, covered with gilded edges. But what truly stole Ilias's breath was what stood behind the table. A chair, turned with its back to him, and over it, as if someone had been sitting there just moments ago, a dress. A light dress, delicate, of pale fabric, exactly the kind of dress the woman wore in the portraits. Elias felt the world stop. That chair was not arranged for show. That dress was not placed as decoration. It had been left there, worn, lived in, and the presence was everywhere in that hall, as if he had just stepped into a place where someone had taken a deep breath seconds earlier. The mansion seemed to pulse more strongly here, as if this were the center of everything, the heart of the house. And when Elias approached the table, he noticed a detail that made him shiver. The white-covered book was not just resting there, it was open, turned toward him, like a page prepared to be read. And at the top of the page, there was a single sentence written in fresh ink, so fresh it still seemed to glisten. "Now I can begin to tell you who I was." Ilias felt his throat go dry. The ink, still damp. The perfume, still in the air. The dress, still warm. He didn't dare touch it, but his instincts said yes. And in that instant, for the first time since he'd arrived at the mansion, something became clear. That woman's story was not just past, it was present, and it was being written or rewritten before him, by her, for him. All the candles in the hall shuddered as if touched by an invisible hand. The light danced along the walls, creating shadows that moved in waves, as if they were breathing. Elias did not move. The air around him grew warmer, a human temperature, too close, too personal. A breeze brushed the back of his neck. It wasn't cold, it was warm, it was intimate, like a kiss. His body reacted in a contradictory way, a chill across his skin, but a deep heat in his chest. It was the kind of sensation that can't be explained with logic. It was emotional, instinctive, and carried a grief so deep it felt older than that night. Elias did not turn immediately. He was afraid of seeing nothing, or of seeing everything. He kept his eyes fixed on the open book on the table. The sentence written in fresh ink seemed to pulse, as if the words had a life of their own. "Now I can begin to tell you who I was." The letters had long, gentle strokes, unmistakable. The same handwriting as in the diary. The same hand, the same woman. Elias stretched out his hand to touch the paper, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. He needed to feel whether it really existed, whether it wouldn't evaporate at contact, like a dream too fragile to survive human touch. The tips of his fingers barely brushed the page. The entire room reacted. The candles flickered again, this time like a wave rippling from one end of the hall to the other. The curtains moved even though there were no open windows, and the dress on the chair lifted slightly, as if the fabric were breathing. Elias stepped back. His heart pounded hard, but not from irrational fear. It was more complex. It felt like standing before something too sacred, too intimate, something that, in some mysterious way, was tied to his own emotional past. The floral perfume flooded the air, more intense than ever, as if the presence were now right beside him, just a few inches away. The dress settled back down, the candles steadied, and the hall returned to its thick, but not empty, silence. Elias moved closer to the table again, and this time he read not only the sentence at the top of the page, but also the next paragraph, written just below the newly formed lines flowing across the paper as if they'd been laid there seconds earlier. If you're reading this, then you've found my path. I don't know who you are, not with living eyes, but I felt, for years, that someone would come. I felt your pain. I felt your loss. I felt the weight you carry without admitting it to anyone. Elias recoiled from the table under the emotional impact of those words. How did she know? How could she possibly know? He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to contain the inner wave rising within him. The mansion seemed to amplify everything he felt, as if the walls absorbed his emotions and threw them back at him, multiplied. He kept reading. I carried weights like that too. I waited too, and when the waiting grew too long, the house began to keep what I could no longer carry alone. I know you must be afraid. That's natural, but you didn't come here for nothing. No one reaches this house by mistake. The handwriting seemed to tremble slightly at the end of the sentence, as if the hand that wrote it was overtaken by some strong emotion or by exhaustion. Further down, that's why I ask you not to run. The truth hurts, but it also heals, and what you came to find is not just an answer, but release. Elias closed the book carefully, unhurried, but with the decision of someone who needs to breathe away from something for a few seconds. The hall felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if the space were being shaped by the emotions filling the air. He took a few steps back. Behind the table, the dress hanging on the chair seemed to mimic him, as if the presence that had moved closer before now stepped back as well, accompanying him, mirroring him. It was impossible to ignore the feeling. Elias wasn't just reading a story, he was part of it. The presence that woman was interacting with him in an active, conscious, emotional way. He ran a hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts, but then something on the floor, just in front of the table, caught his attention. Another petal, but not like the others. This one was torn in half, as if it had been crushed by delicate fingers before being released. And there was one detail that made his heart stop for a moment. A tiny streak of fresh ink clung to it, as if the same hand that had written in the book had held that petal seconds later. Elias knelt, touching it with extreme care. The petal was warm. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't a trick. It was a recent touch. He held it for a few seconds, then lifted his gaze to the dress. The fabric seemed to have shifted again, so subtly it would be easy to call it an illusion, if not for the emotional weight that came with the movement. And then, a sound cut through the silence, a soft tapping, coming from one of the walls covered by the wine-colored curtains. Then another, and another, as if someone were running a hand along the fabric on the other side. As if someone were calling. Elias stood, moving cautiously toward the curtain. Each step came with a blend of anxiety and expectation. The sound continued, rhythmic, soft, almost affectionate. He pulled the curtain aside. Behind it, there was no solid wall, as he had imagined. There was another hidden door, a door similar to the one in the underground corridor, but more delicate, with smaller floral carvings, as if it had been made to guard something intimate, not dangerous. The tapping stopped the moment Elias touched the door's surface. He took a deep breath. The air around him smelled of flowers, fresh ink, and a faint trace of sadness. Very carefully, Elias pushed the door. It opened silently, revealing a narrow, short corridor lit by a soft yellow light, like the light of a bedroom where someone has just woken up. At the end of the corridor, there was a single open door, and from inside it came a sound that made Elias shiver. A song, not from an instrument, not from a radio. It was singing, a woman's voice, low, delicate, almost a lament, an old melody, full of longing, as if sung more for herself than for any listener. The voice seemed to come from someone who no longer belonged to the world, but still refused to leave it completely. Elias felt his legs move forward almost on their own. The song was a calling, an invisible thread, a promise. With each step, the melody grew clearer, more human, more sorrowful. When he reached the open door, the song stopped abruptly, as if the voice knew he had arrived, and then he saw. In the center of the softly lit room was a simple bed, covered with a light blanket. On the bed, carefully placed, was a portrait. The same woman's face, but this time smiling, a smile he had never seen in the other paintings. Beside the portrait rested an object that made his breath catch. A broken necklace, with a pendant in the shape of a petal, and of all the perfumes in the house, this room held the strongest. Here, by the scent, by the light, by the delicacy, was where she slept, or where she had slept, in what she called life. And whatever was waking now, was not dead, and was not alive, but was deeply bound to what it had once been. The feeling of hearing those words, even if only inside his own mind, crossed Elias like a silent lightning bolt. There was no concrete sound in the room, no vibration of air that could be measured. Even so, the message echoed within him with unquestionable clarity, as if an ancient memory, one that should never have belonged to him, had suddenly been awakened. Someone, somewhere between what is living and what is gone, recognized him as someone returning. That idea threw him off balance inside. He stood by the bed for a few seconds, breathing with difficulty, trying to understand why that sense of coming back felt so familiar. He didn't know that mansion. He had never been in that town before that desperate escape. There was no objective memory to justify the feeling of reunion. And yet, the sensation persisted, insistent, as if the house itself whispered that not every memory is made of clear images. Some are only emotional impressions that live in the body. The necklace on the bed called to him in an almost physical way. The petal-shaped pendant was small, delicate, with a soft outline and a faint mark on its surface, as if it had been pressed many times by anxious fingers. The chain was broken near the junction with the pendant, as if it had snapped in a sudden gesture, a moment too intense to be borne. Elias reached out and touched the metal. The chill of the object was quickly replaced by an unexpected warmth, as if the memory contained within it refused to remain inert. A wave of shapeless images crossed his mind as if he were looking through fogged glass. A veranda at dusk, a woman's hand holding that same pendant, a voice singing a sad melody he somehow recognized even though he had never heard it before in conscious life. Elias's heart sped up, not from sheer shock, but from a strange kind of longing. It was as if that room, that necklace, that perfume, and that silent presence awakened in him a grief he didn't know how to name. A grief that didn't belong only to the woman who had lived there, but to him as well, on some hidden level. A grief that inevitably merged with what he had brought with him when he fled his old life. There was, in his path before the mansion, a story of interrupted love, not a loud tragedy, but a slow wearing down, a sequence of postponed decisions, confessions never made, swallowed words. At some point, the bond he had sworn to protect broke. Maybe by his fault, maybe not. The result was the same. He carried a sense of failure and loss that ate at him from the inside, as if he had betrayed not only someone, but a promise to his own destiny. There, in front of the broken necklace, that guilt seemed to take on physical form, as if the broken link in the chain were the reflection of what he had shattered in his own life. He closed his eyes for a few moments, squeezing the pendant between his fingers. The mansion seemed to notice the gesture, because the air grew denser, the floral perfume more present, almost like a silent comfort. It was not a place that judged him. It was a place that understood him. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed a detail beside the headboard of the bed, a small, narrow table on which rested a few personal objects, a half-full perfume bottle, a hairbrush with a few dark strands still caught in it, and a light-covered notebook, smaller than the others he had seen in the house, almost like a bedside diary. He approached, placing the necklace carefully on the blanket beside the smiling portrait. The smile in that image disturbed and drew him in at the same time. It was different from the expression in the other paintings scattered throughout the mansion. There, the young woman seemed more alive, less burdened, as if that instant had been captured in a rare moment of peace. The notebook on the table was open to a page only half filled. The handwriting was the same, slanted, elegant, carrying a melancholy that showed even in the way the letters touched the paper. Some lines spoke of the difficulty of sleeping, of the feeling that the house was never truly empty, even when no other voices echoed through the halls. There were mentions of the sky seen from the window, of nights when the wind seemed to bring messages she couldn't fully decipher. At one point, the words grew deeper. There are nights when I feel like my heart is divided between two times. One of them is this one, where I walk the halls, tidy the room, light candles, and write. The other is a place I cannot reach, but that insists on calling me. It's as if a part of me remembers someone who has not arrived yet, just below. I don't know if it's madness or faith, but something in me clings to the idea that love is not limited by chronology. Maybe there is a reunion marked somewhere ahead, on a day when I am no longer here as I am now. Maybe I need to become nothing but memory so that he, at last, can enter. Elias felt a different weight as he read those lines. It wasn't just emotion, it was recognition. The idea of a love not limited by time had always seemed like fantasy to him, until life began taking things away from him without any logical explanation. Losses that felt out of order, out of context, as if someone were shuffling the pages of his story without following the correct sequence. Further down, near the bottom of the page, there was another passage. If you've made it to this room, then you already know more than I ever managed to say out loud. Maybe you've discovered my fears, my promises, my silences, everything I couldn't save in life. I give to the house. It keeps, it waits, it calls. And if, by any chance, you feel as broken as I did, I ask only one thing: don't run at the first opportunity. The door that closes is cruel, but it is also mercy. It stops you from going back to what destroyed you before you ready to look back with different eyes. The impact of those words was brutal. And as Elias sat on that bed, with the photograph in his hand and the necklace at his side, the mansion, in its immense loneliness, seemed to sigh, as if, finally, after so many years, it was watching two wounded stories begin to touch. Sleeping was not Ilias's intention. He had only closed his eyes to ease the emotional weight, to rest his mind for a few seconds, but his body gave in without resistance, as if the bed held a silent force that gently pulled him into a state he had never been in before. The floral perfume stayed around him, constant, circling like invisible arms that rocked him, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. The room disappeared like scattered mist. The dark walls of the mansion dissolved. The rain outside became pure silence. Elias found himself walking through a corridor he didn't recognize, yet his mind accepted it as if he had passed through there dozens of times. That's how dreams tend to work, turning the strange into familiar. But this wasn't an ordinary dream. It was far too different. The walls were light, adorned with smaller paintings, all depicting fields of flowers. The smell wasn't the mansion's, it was the smell of clean air, of sunlight streaming in through open windows, of freshly cut flowers and simple vases spread over the wooden floor. He walked slowly, feeling the texture of the floor under his feet, hearing the faint creak of new boards, nothing like the tired, old wood of the real house. Outside, the distant sound of voices, laughter, the soft murmur of a life that made sense. Every detail, every color, every shadow had a realism that went beyond the limits of dreams. And then he saw her, at the end of the corridor, standing before an open door. There she was, the woman, the same from the portraits, the same from the perfume, the same from the letters, but now alive, with a body, with breath, with warmth. She wasn't shadow, wasn't silhouette, wasn't sensation, she was real. The light dress fell over her curves in a simple way, nothing like the motionless fabric resting over the chair in the candle hall. Her dark hair was loosely tied, with a few strands escaping to frame her face, and her eyes. Those eyes he had only seen in paintings, now shone in front of him with such human depth that Elias felt his heart falter for a moment. He tried to say her name but realized he didn't know it. He tried to call her anything at all, but no sound came out. It was as if language itself had gotten stuck in his throat. She watched him with a mixture of surprise and tenderness. It wasn't the gaze of someone looking at a stranger. It was the gaze of someone who meets again, who recognizes, who has waited a long time. Her smile was gentle, almost shy, a smile that existed in none of the house's portraits. "You came back," she said, and this time Elias heard it clearly, as if the sentence were spoken both inside and outside of him at once. Her voice was everything he had imagined and more. Sweet, but carrying something ancient. Delicate, but firm, like someone who had suffered enough to understand the fragility of happiness. Elias took a step toward her. The floor seemed to move with him, as if it wanted to make the approach easier, but something kept him from reaching her. A strange feeling, as if he were walking against an invisible current. She stretched out her hand. Elias did the same, but before their fingers could touch, the scene changed. The bright corridor darkened, as if a gigantic shadow had passed in front of the sun. The paintings of flowering fields dissolved like wet paint sliding down the wall. The distant laughter turned into a moan of pain. And the woman stepped back, frightened. "No, not now," she said, her voice trembling, as if speaking to something beyond him. The world around them began to unravel into threads of light, and Elias was torn from that dream with brutal force. He woke with a jolt. The room was exactly as before, the walls, the bed, the broken necklace on the blanket, the floral perfume saturating the air, but his body was taken by a deep shiver, the kind that starts in the soul before reaching the skin. He sat up at once, breathing deeply, trying to understand what had just happened. It was not just a dream. He knew it. He felt it. The floral perfume was still there, but there was something else in the air now, a different note, subtle, as if another layer of scent had joined the others. It was more bitter, more tense. Elias brought his hand to his chest, and froze. On his shirt right in the center there was something that hadn't been there before, a faint mark, of fingers, as if a light hand had truly rested on his chest while he slept. The shock didn't come as fear, but as a deep unease. He touched the mark, feeling the skin still warm where those invisible fingers had been. It wasn't a dream. The presence had been there, with him, beside him. And when he looked at the broken necklace, he noticed something even more disturbing. The pendant was on one side of the bed, the chain on the other, as if they had been separated while he slept, or during the encounter. He stood up, feeling his legs slightly shaky, and went to the window. The glass was fogged, as if a recent breath had formed there, and when Elias came closer, he saw a shape left in the condensation, a drawing, made with a finger, a flower, simple, with one missing petal. exactly like the pendant, and a curved line just beneath it, almost like a smile. Elias stepped back, gripping the window frame. The emotion was so intense he couldn't process it right away. She was trying to tell him something, trying to come closer, trying to reconnect. Something he didn't understand, but that he felt. The scent in the room became softer, calmer, as if the presence were watching his reaction with gentleness. And then the sound came. Not from inside the room, not from the hallway, but from the walls of the mansion. A low, deep, almost organic sound, as if the house were sighing. Elias listened closely. The house was alive in that breath. It was present, and it was restless. Not restless because of him, restless because of her. As if something in that attempt at an encounter had been interrupted by the house, or by something inside it. For the first time he felt the tension between the feminine presence and the mansion itself, as if the home that had kept her for so long were afraid of what might happen when she came too close. As if the house had loved her too, or depended on her, and now feared losing her. Elias turned back to the necklace. The pendant shone almost imperceptibly under the soft light. It was an invitation, a peace, a key, and in the bedside diary there were still pages left to read. Pages that might speak not only of her, but of what the house was trying to hide. He picked up the notebook and readied himself to open to the next page. Before he could, however, he heard something behind him, a light touch at the bedroom door. 3 soft knocks, like the ones he'd heard in the candle hall. And then, a voice, this time not in a dream, not in memory, but like a breath in the air, spoke the words he never expected to hear so soon. Elias, come. There was no anger, no urgency, there was longing. And when he opened the door, the corridor was lit by a trail of fresh petals leading back to the circular hall. As if, finally, she were ready to show him the next secret. The hallway was almost motionless, except for the soft glow that seemed to emanate from the petals scattered across the floor. There were so many, more than at any other time since he had entered the mansion. Fresh, damp, carefully arranged. It wasn't a trail left by chance, it was a path. Elias took the first step cautiously, but without hesitation. The house seemed to watch his every move, adjusting its own silence as he advanced. There was a change in the atmosphere. Before, the floral perfume had been the dominant sign, constant, enveloping. Now, there was something more, a new note. Something like burnt wood. Not of destruction, but of remembrance. As if some part of the mansion kept an old trauma, dormant, waiting for the moment to be revealed. He walked slowly, feeling the emotion swell as he followed the trail. The petals seemed to give off a kind of glow of their own, as if they reflected a light that wasn't physical, but emotional. With each step, Elias felt that he was returning not to a place he knew, but to a feeling he had lived in another life, in some old dream, or in the memories of someone who now shared their very soul with him. When he reached the end of the corridor, he saw that the trail turned, following the staircase and leading back to the candle hall. But the hall was no longer as before. The candlelight was now more intense, forming circles of brightness that spread across the floor like small suns. The flames did not flicker, they seemed still, suspended in a state of absolute watchfulness. The dress on the chair was still there, but it had changed position. Before, it had lain there like abandoned fabric. Now, it looked carefully arranged, sleeves aligned, hem draped over the seat, as if someone had lovingly straightened it moments earlier. Elias stepped in slowly. The door behind him closed with a soft click. The hall received him as if it had been prepared for that exact moment. The presence, the woman, was there, not visible, but so strong that the air seemed shaped by her. The trail of petals ended right at the foot of the table with the white-covered book. And now, the book was turned to another page. It couldn't have been the wind, nor any mechanism. It was direct intervention. Elias approached and read, "The house is restless." The phrase, isolated at the top of the page, seemed to echo not only in the room, but inside him. Further down, "It has protected me from many things, from certain truths, from pains I could not bear. But there are moments when even what protects us becomes a prison." The handwriting was shakier, more emotional. "You must not fear it, Elias. It welcomed you because it feels your pain, but it does not decide everything. There are parts of me that the house tries to hide, parts it thinks you shouldn't see. Because it fears that, once you see them, you'll want to leave." Elias felt his breath falter. The house, was it trying to protect him, or to protect her? He kept reading, "But I need you to see. Even if it hurts, even if it haunts you, because the truth is not simple, and because the story that binds us does not begin here." The sensation that ran through Elias was so intense he had to brace his hand against the table. "Binds us." She had written, "binds us." It wasn't symbolic. And then, in smaller letters, "When I die, Elias." He froze. The words seemed to open an old, deep wound in the page. It will not be the end, but it will not be as they imagine either. The ink looked fresh, far too fresh. Some lines were smudged, as if invisible tears had fallen onto the paper. The house kept me and hid me, and now it fights against me because it knows you are the key. Elias stepped back automatically, not in rejection but under the weight of that revelation, so dense that the air itself felt like it trembled. He was the key. To what? To free her, to free the house, or to free himself? The candle flames began to flicker slightly, as if an invisible wind were circling the hall, but there was no wind. It was emotion, it was presence, and then a sound came from the door, a gentle knock, not the same as before, a slower, deeper knock, almost resigned. Elias turned, and for a moment he believed he saw something reflected on the dark surface of the wood. A face, not her face, but something close, distant, as if it were trapped at the edge between wanting to appear and not being allowed to. And the floral perfume grew stronger, spreading through the hall in waves. The voice came again, this time not as a whisper, but as something that rose together with his name inside him. Elias. Don't believe everything you see. He froze. It was not her voice. It was another, lower, older, something or someone besides her inhabited the mansion. Another presence, another kind of power. And that presence did not want him to get any closer to the truth. The house trembled very slightly, as if deep changes were underway. The book turned one more page on its own. The ink on the newly exposed side looked angrier, as if it had been written in haste, in desperation, in fear of interruption. If the house speaks to you, don't listen. It doesn't know everything. It believes it must keep me. But I need you to see what it fears to show. For a full moment, Elias stood there, caught between two forces. The woman who called him, and the mansion that held him. The perfume and the shadows. The book and the closed door. The truth and the fear. And then the candlelight shrank suddenly, as if all the flames were sucked into themselves for a brief second. When they returned, the room was different. Behind the dress on the chair, a figure was now visible. A feminine silhouette, but blurred, like a reflection in rippling water. She wasn't looking at Elias, she was looking at the book, and the gesture of her hand was one of pleading. She wanted him to keep going, to read, to find out. Elias moved closer to the open page. At the bottom, written so quickly that some of the words slipped out of their natural alignment, the door at the end of the hallway, the one that never opens. Behind it is the truth. But you must go before the house fully wakes up. It does not want you to enter, but I am there. Elias felt the floor tremble beneath his feet. The door that never opens. He knew which one it was. That one, on the ground floor, in the narrow corridor he had only observed from afar. A heavy door, without an external doorknob, with deep marks in the wood, marks he had assumed were old, but now, in the light of this revelation, seemed like the result of desperate attempts by someone trying to get out, or in. The figure near the dress tilted her head, as if asking him to hurry. The petals on the floor began to move, sliding, as if pushed by invisible fingers, direction out of the hall, into the corridor, toward the forbidden door. And for a moment, Elias felt something ignite inside him, courage, or destiny, or need. He walked, heart steady, the perfume following him like a faithful guardian. When he opened the hall door, he found something that hadn't been there before. The entire mansion was in half light, as if it were waking up and realizing what he was about to do. The corridor that led to the forbidden door seemed different, though it was the same one Elias had noticed before from a distance. The half-light filling the mansion gave the space the look of perpetual twilight, as if time inside had decided to stop at a single moment of hesitation. The walls, lined with aged wallpaper, seemed closer, as though the corridor narrowed as he advanced. The floor creaked under his feet, but the sound was different from other times. Before, the wood complained with the fatigue of age. Now, each creak sounded like a stifled whisper, a mute warning, an almost pleading request for him to turn back. The mansion was not indifferent to what was about to happen. The house felt reacted, suffered. The flower left in front of the door caught Elias' attention like a point of light in the dimness. Unlike the petals scattered throughout the mansion, this one was not torn, not crushed, not scattered. It was whole, perfect, its edges translucent with freshness, as if it had been picked seconds before, a kind of final gift, or final permission. Her presence was so strong in that hallway that the air felt thicker, warmer. It wasn't the oppressive weight of the house, but a timid warmth, almost vulnerable, as if the young woman who inhabited that place were in her invisible form, standing there right beside him, waiting for what he would decide. Elias stopped in front of the flower and knelt. His fingers touched the petals lightly, as if afraid to hurt them. The living texture, the delicate softness, the intense perfume rising immediately, all of it confirmed that this flower could not have come from the neglected garden outside without losing some of its vitality. This was more than a simple aesthetic gesture, it was an act of will. It was the last key, but not one that fit into a metal mechanism. It was an emotional key. Ilias's gaze rose slowly from the flower to the door. It rose before him like a solid wall, its wood darkened by decades, heavy metal fittings embedded in its design. There were deep marks on the lower panel, irregular scratches, some horizontal, others vertical, some long, others short, as if nails or some sharp object had been dragged repeatedly across the surface in moments of desperation. Those marks told a story no one had ever spoken aloud. Stories of someone who tried to get out, or in. Stories of someone held the end as Ilias sat on that bed, with the photograph in his hand and the necklace at his side. The mansion, in its immense loneliness, seemed to sigh as if, finally, after so many years, it was watching two wounded stories begin to touch, by a force greater than their own will. The house seemed to concentrate a large part of its memory at that point. Ilias ran his hand over the marks, feeling the grooves beneath his skin. The wood was cold, but not inert. It seemed to vibrate faintly, as if it sheltered something not entirely asleep. The mansion didn't want him to cross that boundary. Yet at the same time there was another, gentler, insistent force asking him to do exactly that. When he stepped back a little to see the whole door, he noticed a detail he hadn't seen before. Just above the frame, nearly hidden in shadow, was a small symbol carved into the wood, a stylized flower with one missing petal. The same motif repeated in the necklace pendant, in the drawing on the fogged glass, in the scattered petals. It was as if that symbol were the seal of her story, stamped onto the places where her presence was strongest. The idea that the truth about the young woman, about her death, about her remaining in that house, about the inexplicable bond with him, lay beyond that door solidified with almost painful clarity. And with that idea came fear. Not the childish fear of the dark or of ghosts, but the adult fear of what can completely reconfigure the way you see yourself. The fear of finding something that makes it impossible to go back to being who you were until then. The mansion seemed to understand that fear better than he did, and perhaps that was why it resisted. There were memories that saved, there were memories that destroyed, and there were those that did both at the same time. Ilias took a deep breath, feeling his lungs burn with air that seemed thicker than normal. Somewhere in the house, a distant door slammed shut by itself, as if the mansion wanted to show its silent disapproval. Elsewhere, a board cracked loudly, echoing through the hallway. Everything sounded like the protest of an organism sensing an irreversible change. But there was another sign as well, a perfume, so intense it almost overwhelmed his senses. The floral scent filled the corridor, wrapping Ilias as if it were a physical presence around him, an embrace that could not be seen, only felt. The perfume seemed to say what words could not reach, that he was not alone in this confrontation, that the courage he needed did not belong only to him, but to them. He moved closer to the door again, this time with the whole flower in hand. He caressed the wooden surface as if touching a wounded body and placed the flower on a small ledge in the frame, just below the carved symbol. The contrast between the delicate life of the flower and the hardness of the wood seemed to create a strange, almost ritual point of balance. Then his fingers searched for some kind of handle, latch, or crack that might indicate an opening mechanism. The door, however, appeared smooth, solid, continuous, as if it had been made to be final. But nothing in that house was completely closed. Ilias ran his hand along the entire frame, down the sides, across the top, along the joints. At one point, on the left side, he felt an irregularity, a part of the wood carved into a subtle recess, almost invisible to the eye but noticeable to the touch. A narrow slot, exactly the size of a pendant. Ilias's chest tightened. It wasn't a coincidence. The broken necklace in the bedroom, the petal-shaped pendant, the flower drawn on the glass, the symbol on the door. Everything converged on that point. He knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that the pendant was the key. The house seemed to shudder in protest, as if it had understood perfectly the conclusion he had just reached. The air turned colder for a few seconds, and the light, that sourceless brightness filling the corridor, grew dimmer, as if the very environment were making one last effort to make him give up. But there was another side in this battle. The perfume intensified again, this time with an almost painful sweetness, as if the young woman, in her invisible and persistent form, were fighting for the chance to be seen, heard, fully understood. The house might want to protect her from her own pain and from other eyes, but she, it seemed, had made her choice long ago. She wanted to be found, by him. Elias felt inside himself a kind of unspoken pact forming between his will and hers. He didn't quite know where this trust came from, but it was there, solid, as if it had been built over entire lifetimes, even though he was only now becoming aware of it. Without further hesitation, he turned and began to climb back up toward the bedroom where the necklace awaited him. Every step, every corridor, every shadow seemed to follow him with invisible eyes. The entire mansion was paying attention, but there was no longer any psychological return from that path. When he entered the perfumed, luminous room again, he found everything as before: the made bed, the smiling portrait, the bedside diary. The pendant lay where he had left it, shining faintly in the soft light. When he picked it up, the metal warmed quickly in his palm, as if the object were reacting to the decision. The feeling wasn't one of threat, but of alignment. The memories etched into the metal seemed to recognize that what was about to happen was, finally, the missing step. Back in the hallway of the forbidden door, with the pendant held firmly between his fingers, Elias sensed the house reacting to each approach. In the portraits along the way, the figures seemed darker, as if disapproving of his boldness. In some spots, a sudden cold wind appeared from nowhere, only to vanish again. In others, the air became so still it felt as though there were no oxygen left. Even so, the perfume remained persistent, gentle, loyal. Standing before the door, he fit the pendant into the slot in the frame with a precision only possible because that moment had been designed long before he existed. The metal settled with an almost imperceptible click. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a sound, from inside the structure of the door, as if ancient gears, stopped for decades, were beginning to move again. A subtle jolt passed through the wood, and the deep marks on the panel seemed, for a second, more recent, as if they relived the past in that gesture. Elias stepped back, keeping his hand near the pendant, almost as a reflex of protection. The entire corridor held its breath. The inner mechanism gave one final snap, and then the door yielded slightly, opening just enough to let a crack appear, and from that gap came a darkness unlike any he had yet seen in that house. It was not the darkness of empty basements or unlit rooms. It was a darkness loaded with meaning, and mixed with it, a change in the perfume, still floral, but with a deeper, melancholy, almost cutting note. It was as if, behind that door, her story were being exposed for the first time in its rawest form. Not only the melancholic, poetic version that appeared in the diaries, letters, and idyllic images, but what had been pure suffering, pure fear, total rupture. Elias felt a weight in his chest, as if his heart sensed what awaited him inside. But he also felt something else, something coming from the same source, but with a different purpose, a promise. Not the simplistic promise of comfort, but the promise of truth, the promise of finally seeing what had always been hidden from her, from him, and from the house itself. The mansion grew even quieter. It was as if the entire organism made of wood, stone, glass, and memories were standing at the edge of something it could no longer fully control. Elias placed his hand on the door, ready to push it open all the way. And in that brief interval between intention and gesture, he felt the clear impression of soft fingers resting on top of his, not stopping him, not guiding him, just accompanying. The decision was his, but she was with him. He didn't know if he was about to set her free, or imprison himself with her forever. Still, he pushed the door open as if exhaling the last breath of a forgotten body. The air that escaped from inside brought with it a cold that wasn't physical, but memorial, a cold made of everything, interrupted, broken, silenced. Elias stepped in, and the door closed behind him with a softness that only made the gesture more threatening. It was smaller than the others, with darkened wooden walls and windows boarded over with aged planks. The light that filtered through the cracks was weak, almost gray. In the center of the room there was an old, narrow bed, covered with a pale sheet. her heart breaking with it, a waiting that became illness, an illness that became silence, and the house saturated with her soul, her longing, her last breath kept everything. Elias collapsed to his knees. He understood, it was not by chance that he had reached the mansion, but it also wasn't meant for him to have entered. The perfume around him changed. It grew denser, heavier, sadder. It was as if her presence, the one he had felt so many times, were now right in front of him, kneeling with him, showing him her final truth. And she spoke inside him, not in words, but in feeling. He was the echo, the repetition, the substitute, the late shadow of the man she had waited for until she died. She did not love him. She recognized him not as beloved, but as continuation. The house, on the other hand, had never wanted him to see this, because it knew that once he saw it, Elias would never leave. He felt, with brutal clarity, the invisible force of the mansion moving around him. The wood groaned, the walls seemed to shrink, the floor vibrated low, like some deep organism awakening. She, the presence, tried to hold it back, but she was far too weak now. Decades trapped between worlds had drained what remained of her strength. Elias finally understood what the house did, what it repeated, what it needed. The mansion was a womb of dead memories, and it fed on broken souls. The young woman had been its first victim, and he was about to be the second. The perfume became suffocating. The cold intensified. The shadows in the room began to writhe in the corners, as if gaining their own form. The door behind him, now invisible in the gloom, vanished. It wasn't just closed, it was as if it had never existed. The house swallowed him, inch by inch, like someone closing their eyes to refuse to see the truth. Her presence came closer. Elias felt two cold hands rest on his face, not with anger, not with desire, but with a pain so deep it seemed to dissolve the air. She tried to speak, but couldn't. She only cried. And when her tears fell, not real drops, but pure sensations, Elias saw his own image reflected in the lifeless eyes of the body on the bed. And only then did he understand the final secret. The young woman had never known him, had never been connected to him, had never had any destiny bearing his name. The bond was with the house. The house was the creature. The house was the wounded lover. The house was the broken heart. The house used her memory to lure, used her perfume to trap, used her longing to feed. And now it would use Elias. He tried to stand, but the floor began to close around his feet, like invisible roots climbing his legs. Darkness swallowed his vision. The floral perfume burned the air in his lungs, and her presence, the true one, drew away, too sad to help him, too weak to save him. He saw her shape dissolve, returning to the body that would not rest. Elias screamed, but no sound came out. The mansion swallowed his voice. The house pulled him in, first by the skin, then by the bones, then by the part that hurts without a body, the soul. When the process was over, the room fell silent. The young woman's body remained motionless on the bed. The pendant fell back to the floor, and the perfume, now weaker, spread through the air like a final farewell. The house went back to sleep, but not completely, because now, in the deep silence of that forbidden room, there were two hearts trapped, and the mansion, satisfied but never complete, waited for the next traveler who would flee their own life and seek shelter where they should not. And somewhere in the darkness, two presences let out a joint whisper, sad, eternal, resigned, "Don't come back." But as always, it would be too late.